Monday to Friday at 12:30 p.m. only on Bloomberg Quint.
Good morning. You're watching All You Need to Know on Bloomberg Quint Live, and I'm Alex Matthew. First, the headlines this morning. Asian stock markets are off to a positive start after equities on Wall Street posted their biggest gain in 6 weeks. UK Prime Minister Theresa May is said to have got legally binding changes to the Brexit deal ahead of a vote in Parliament later this week. Oil prices jumped on Monday after Saudi Arabia is said to continue with deeper production cuts, producing less than the 10 million barrels per day that was committed earlier. Jet Airways promoter Naresh Goyal has sought an urgent 750 crore rupee infusion from Etihad, citing the airline's precarious position. The Directorate General of Civil Aviation has issued additional safety guidelines to SpiceJet and Jet Airways for operating the Boeing 737 MAX planes. This after a second such aircraft crashed in as many months over the weekend, this time in Ethiopia. Let's talk about the U.S. markets now. Positive news on the economy in the U.S. came as a breath of fresh air for investors in that country, especially after a woeful jobs report on Friday and continued suggestions of slowing economic growth resulted in the worst weekly performance for equities on Wall Street in 2019 last week. Now, positive retail sales in January after the sharp drop in the previous month bolstered sentiment. Abigail Doolittle of Bloomberg News tells you everything that happened in that session in this report.
Stocks rallied in Monday's Wall Street session. In fact, it was the best day for the major averages since the end of January. At the end of the day, the Dow underperformed, but even so was up 0.8%. The S&P 500 up 1.5%, and the tech-heavy Nasdaq did the best, up 2%. Not surprisingly, technology was the best sector for the S&P 500, then up more than 2%. But all 11 sectors were higher. The bullish attitude and tone really coming to some degree from a U.S. retail sales beat for the month of January, reversing a big decline in December. So investors taking some cheer there. But again, technology very strong. That came out of some tech strength in the Asian session. On the day, Apple up more than 3% on an upgrade over at Bank of America Merrill Lynch to a buy. Facebook also upgraded to a buy at no more. Those shares up 1.5%. And NVIDIA, the chip maker, those shares rallying 7%, even though they are acquiring Mellanox, a smaller chip maker. Typically, the acquirer isn't trading higher, but investors are in such a bullish mood and seem to think this deal makes sense. Both of those shares having their best day of the year. But Boeing, unfortunately, down 5.3%, well off the lows. But this, of course, on that tragic Ethiopian Airlines 737 MAX crash, investors selling those shares. But overall, it was a risk-on day. Stocks higher, oil was higher, Haven bonds lower. Again, Monday's Wall Street session was risk-on. In New York, Abigail Doolittle, Bloomberg News.
And that positivity is in fact carrying over to the Asian markets this morning. Let's go straight across to Bloomberg's Sophie Kamruddin, who's joining us live from the Hong Kong studio to tell us all about that. Morning, Sophie. Well, clearly that sluggishness from last week has been shaken off this morning. What are you picking up?
Yeah, Asian stocks are regaining their mojo as the risk factors are aligning from solid U.S. retail sales data to increasing relief that there will not be a hard Brexit. And that is sending the British pound towards the best two-day gain since November as the UK and EU modified their deal ahead of Tuesday's key vote in the British Parliament. Now, in equity markets, we have Japan leading the advance in Asia with the Nikkei 225 adding 1.7%. Chip stocks are climbing in Tokyo and Seoul, tracking U.S. peers higher, as Abigail noted, on the back of NVIDIA agreeing to buy Mellanox Tech for $6.9 billion. So Samsung is among the biggest boosts for the Kospi in Seoul. Now, over in Sydney, the ASX 200 is snapping a two-day drop. And here in Hong Kong, you have the Hang Seng extending gains with almost all sectors in the black. But Chinese internet giant Meituan is an outlier, sliding after posting a wider loss in the December quarter as profitability shrank in travel and bike sharing. Now, over in Shanghai, we have the benchmark adding nearly 1% at the start of cash trade amid commentary from Chinese officials regarding liberalization of mainland markets. Back to you.
Thanks so much for that, Sophie. Well, Sophie did mention the Brexit, and in fact, the updates there are with just over 2 weeks to go for the March 29 deadline, UK Prime Minister Theresa May is said to have negotiated legally binding changes to the Brexit deal, including one on the Irish backstop issue. This, in fact, comes ahead of the crucial Brexit vote in Parliament that will determine the fate of the outcome on the 29th of March. Kathleen Hayes of Bloomberg News brings us this report.
Let's set the stage, because how the last several hours have unfolded. Theresa May apparently was debating with her team whether or not to get on the plane and fly to Strasbourg until the early afternoon, when she finally did, sat down with Jean-Claude Juncker from the EU Commission for this, what will turn out to potentially have been the final historic meeting that was able to get something on the table to resolve the Irish backstop issue, to preserve an open border between the Republic of Ireland and Northern Ireland, something so important not only to the Irish but across the EU and certainly in the UK as well. So they've got a new, I'm calling it a clause, it's wording around backstop that Theresa May sees as legally binding, although Jean-Claude Juncker referred to it as based on assurances and guarantees. So even that is not exactly hammered out. Nevertheless, here's what Theresa May said about it and why it's so important.
Crucially, one of the requests that Parliament came together and had a majority vote for, was that it should be possible to replace the backstop with alternative arrangements. We have secured within this a very clear timetable that enables the backstop, as defined currently, to be replaced with alternative arrangements.
What Parliament asked for, what she says she is delivering. Now, Jean-Claude Juncker stressed, as did Theresa May, this is an insurance policy. Let's listen to what he said. It's a great metaphor for what they're hoping to achieve with this.
The backstop is an insurance policy. Nothing more, nothing less. The intention is not for it to be used, like in every insurance policy. And if it were ever to be used, it will never be a threat.
There were a couple of other things added to the deal by Theresa May in this compromise with the EU, including a joint statement on the political declaration that hammers out the future relationship between the two countries and how the backstop would work into that. And of course, Jean-Claude Juncker said he hopes that Parliament will ratify the deal, because he says if they don't, that's it. There will be no new negotiations. So this is what's facing Parliament now as they get to vote on this deal of Theresa May's. Has enough been done? We're going to see later on Tuesday.
Yeah, what are we hearing so far in terms of what we could potentially expect? Is there any ray of hope or any sense that Theresa May has come back or is going back to London with any more leverage?
You know, it's interesting, Heidi, because even before Theresa May stepped on that plane, there were some notable skeptics, Eurosceptics, pro-Brexiteers that looked like they were maybe going to come around to at least considering this deal, in part because they do not want to get in a situation where there's no Brexit at all. So in terms of what has been said, let's take a list, actually, of a few prominent things that have been said. For example, Jacob Rees-Mogg, who's the leader of the pro-Brexit Tory European Research Group, very important of all this, said it's too early to tell definitively, but it's clearly a step in the right direction. The Democratic Unionist Party, we're talking about Ireland now, said it would study the deal. Steve Baker, however, who's a Tory Eurosceptic hardliner, said Parliament should fear entrapment in this backstop arrangement. And Jeremy Corbyn, the leader of the Labour opposition, said that negotiations had failed, the MPs should reject it. Now it's up to the Attorney General to take a look at this deal and decide if what is there is legal and can move ahead, Heidi. But we shall see. I'm not in a position to guess what he might say, but certainly that is one more thing to be, more hurdle to be cleared for this vote to get into Parliament and have a chance of passing.
All right, now, one of the big talking points over the weekend and starting into this week was a tragic crash of the Boeing 737 MAX aircraft that belonged to the Ethiopian Airlines. Now, the U.S. aviation regulator, which is the Federal Aviation Administration, or the FAA, has signaled confidence in the safety of the Boeing 737 MAX 8 jetliner. And the regulator has issued a global notice of airworthiness after the model saw its second fatal crash in less than 5 months. Bloomberg's Stephen Engel has more details on this report.
Could have been a longer list of airlines as well that were grounding them had the FAA overnight done a blanket grounding of the aircraft, as it has done only twice in the last 40 years, I might add. So only twice in the last 40 years has the FAA issued a grounding for an entire model of aircraft. That was the Dreamliner in 2013 with the battery problems. Keep in mind, nobody died in those incidents, mostly with ANA, and also back in 1979 when the left engine of a DC-10 fell off in Chicago, killing more than 270 people. The worst aviation disaster still to date in the United States. The DC-10 was grounded. So only twice in the last 40 years, and the FAA right now is sticking with the 737 MAX 8. They put out a global notice of continued airworthiness of this model, despite the 2 accidents we have seen over the last 5 months. Most recently, of course, the Ethiopian Airlines ET302, and also, of course, the Lion Air on October 29th in Indonesia. The global notice from the FAA saying no conclusive evidence linking the loss of ET302 and Lion Air crash. The latest news as well, the flight data and voice recorders have been found. So obviously that will give more information on to the cause of this crash. Still too early to say if those 2 crashes are linked, but the FAA says right now no conclusive evidence. I just want to run through a list of the airlines and countries that have grounded the model so far. China has issued a blanket grounding of all 737 MAX 8s. That was 96 aircraft. Indonesia, also a blanket grounding. That includes Lion Air's 10 in service. They have 190 ordered, by the way. Garuda has 1 in service. Ethiopian Airlines, the victim of this most recent tragedy, has 4. Cayman is grounded. There are 2 737 MAX 8s. Aero Mexico is the latest, just minutes ago, saying they are going to suspend all flights of their 737 MAX 8s. There's 6 of them. And GOL, that's a Brazilian carrier. They have an all 737 fleet, mostly 800s and 700s, but they have 6 MAX 8s. They are also grounding the MAX 8 fleet.
And as Stephen points out, as several countries have grounded the Boeing 737 MAX 8 jets. Meanwhile, the Directorate General of Civil Aviation in India has issued guidelines to the aviation companies in the country who operate these jets in their fleet. According to the guidelines, the pilot commanding the flight should have at least 1,000 hours of flying experience, while the co-pilot should have at least 500 hours. The regulator has also instructed the airlines to ensure various requirements are complied with by the engineering and maintenance personnel with regard to the aircraft, with regard to preparing the aircraft before a flight. All right, now it's time to tell you all about the trade setup for the day, and Agam Vakil is here to tell you all about that and also to tell you what's happening in the futures and options space. Well, Agam, to say that the world equities have shaken off the doldrums of last week would be an understatement, but the Indian markets did that yesterday already, right?
Yeah.
So how are we likely to start today?
Tailwinds is all I can say right now, considering the tremendous up move that we've seen in Asian markets, and that's indicative in the SGX Nifty. And sure, we've seen a lot of strength over the past few days, but today it seems that that strength is likely to continue based on the kind of gains that the SGX Nifty is indicating, at least as far as opening is concerned. Speaking of yesterday, we did see that 1.5% gain in the Nifty. The broader markets had moved in line. In fact, your mid-cap and the small-cap indices outperformed the benchmarks, so there was certainly a lot of buying coming through. And as was the case for the banking indices too. But let's take a look at the ADRs and how they have panned out. Gains across for Vedanta, from Vedanta to something like a Dr. Reddy's to the 2 banks. And of course, so we have gains in Wipro, Tata Motors and Infosys too. But moving on to FIIs, yesterday was a big day of trade. The gross margins, or rather the gross numbers, looked relatively small, but we still had FIIs by stock worth 3,800 crores. On the other hand, DIs did sell stock of around 1,900 crores, but on the institutions in general on a net basis were a lot higher. Now, when it comes to Reliance Industries, ICICI Bank, Bharti Airtel and SBI, it may look like these stocks gave support, but All-round gains came from others out here, where a good bulk of 84 points came in as far as your gains go. Moving on to your futures and options space, and we did see considerable amount of longs building in. 10% seen added in open interest towards the Nifty futures. The Nifty banking futures also saw a significant amount of open interest increase of as much as 2%. This, of course, is your open interest distribution, where we do have, very stiff supports at around 11,000 and 10,900. But when it comes to the up move, well, we really don't know where we're going. So are we heading towards an uncharted territory? That's the big question that we're asking. As far as yesterday's day of trade is concerned, as one might expect, we've seen a little more writing coming through around the 10,900, the 11,000 and the 11,100 mark. And that's the puts I'm talking about. The VIX also fell further, and that, of course, is a positive. And when it comes to the Nifty put-call ratio, that, well, naturally should have edged higher at around 1.73, and as is the case for the bank Nifty put-call ratio at around 1.29. Now, moving on to your stocks, well, we do have the same which are in the F&O band. Jet Airways remains one, and we'll continue to watch out for that one. But Reliance Infra is a new entrant in the F&O band too. And in terms of other stocks, well, there were gains all round. So the likes of Cummins India and HPC Ramco Cement, as well as Godfrey Phillips, stand out in trade. And on the losing end, we do have some weakness in, well, we don't really have weakness. It's about a short covering for Jet Airways, Ajanta Pharma, and Wipro. So we watch out for that one. Well, it was a very strong day of trade, Alex, and it certainly seems like that's going to continue today, at least in the first half.
All right, thanks so much for that, Agam. Well, let's quickly take you through what's making headlines across the globe. Rami Inocencio of Bloomberg News brings you the first word headlines.
First up, new research by Bloomberg Economics shows global growth at its weakest since the financial crisis a decade ago. A new GDP tracker puts expansion at 2.1% on a quarter-on-quarter basis. Now, that's sharply down from 4% in the middle of 2018. The OECD adds to the sour mood, saying momentum in the U.S., the UK, Canada, and the euro area is slowing, although there are signs that China is stabilizing. Oil began the week on the rebound as Saudi Arabia moved to extend supply curbs, and a continuing nationwide power outage threatens production in Venezuela. Futures in New York rose 1.3% after falling last week on weak U.S. payroll numbers. Oil has traded in a tight range after rallying from December lows amid OPEC-driven output curbs, but there are fears a global slowdown will hit demand.
If the economic slowdown indications coming from China, from the car sales to telephones, from telephones to construction industry continues, and if we see a slowdown from China and the rest of the world, this may well have impacts on our demand expectations for this year and maybe beyond.
President Trump has presented a budget which seeks one of the largest cuts to domestic spending while boosting defense coffers and adding more than $8 billion for his border wall. The plan sees rising debt and annual deficits of more than $1 trillion until the year 2022. Now, observers say it's heading for almost certain rejection in the Congress and could trigger a new government shutdown. And Boeing was the biggest faller on the S&P 500 as it tries to deal with a crisis of confidence in its 737 MAX 8. The FAA says the plane remains airworthy despite a second fatal crash in the past 5 months, but the regulator says it will demand flight control enhancements by April. Some airlines and regulators grounded the plane, which is Boeing's best-selling aircraft, generating almost a third of its profit. Global news 24 hours a day, on air and at TikTok, on Twitter, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in more than 120 countries. I'm Rami Inocencio, and this is Bloomberg.
First of all, the world oil demand is growing. There's a lot of hype about the electric cars, this and that. Of course, it will have an impact, those cars, on the oil demand growth rate, but we expect global oil demand will increase average 1 million barrels per day each year. So on demand side. And where will the demand come from? Demand will come from mainly driven by petrochemical industry and aviation. and both of them need lighter crudes, and US shale is a very good fit for that. The world will need US shale, both in terms of volumes and in terms of quality.
So what role then does OPEC and Saudi Arabia play in the world over the next 5 years?
I think they have to, first of all, my very humble advice would be to understand the new realities of the oil markets. This is number one. Number two, they are, especially Saudi Arabia, still a very important country, will be an important country for many years to come, especially feeding the growth in Asia. But at the same time, in my view, in the history of oil, this is the highest time for those countries whose economies are almost exclusively relying on oil and gas revenues need to be broadened. Their economic base need to be broadened. For two reasons. One, a major new guy is coming to markets, the shale on the production side, and also on the consumption side. There are new technologies which will eat up, if not today, tomorrow or the day after tomorrow, the consumption of oil. Electric cars, electric buses, digitalization. So it is now time to diversify the economies in the oil producing countries away from oil, petrochemical industry, gas, but also non-energy related activities to prepare themselves for the future.
So these are the stocks that we need to look at today, starting with HDFC Standard Life. The promoters looking to sell 7 crore equity shares of the company, which is 3.47% of equity. Standard Life has an option to sell an additional 3 crore shares in OFS, which is 1.55% stake. The floor price of the offer is set at rupees 357 per share, which is at an 8.3% discount. Exchange filings show Standard Life has 29.23% stake in the company. Jet Airways denies that it has received 2,050 crores of loan from PNB. Jet delays repayment of ECB due on 11th March availed for working capital purposes. Welspun Corp received additional pipe order of 212 kilometric tons. Out of these orders, 151 kilometric tons will be serviced from India. TRF is looking to issue rupees 250 crore worth of preference shares to Tata Steel. This move is in order to restructure the balance sheet and repay debts. PSP projects receive work orders worth 601 crores from various clients. The total work orders till date stands at 1,442 crores. Lastly, let's have a look at the key bulk deals. Nalanda India Equity Fund acquired 21.11 lakh shares of Matrimony.com at rupees 509.87 each. HDFC Mutual Fund sold 20.13 lakh shares of Matrimony.com, which is 8.83% at 510 rupees each.
Now, the World Wide Web, which is, of course, better known as the Internet, is 30 years old today. It was created by English scientist Tim Berners-Lee while he was working at CERN, the European Organization for Nuclear Research in Switzerland. His vision soon went far beyond a network for scientists to share information, in that he wanted it to be a universal and free information space to share knowledge, to communicate, and to collaborate. In fact, Google commemorated the event with a doodle showing an early version of the computer connecting to the web. All right, well, thank God we have the web. I'm speaking to you on the internet. Anyway, let's tell you what's on the website, BloombergQuint.com. Several stories for you to read. Jet Airways chairman Naresh Goyal has sought urgent funding of 750 crore rupees from equity partner Etihad, citing the very precarious position of the airline following lingering cash flow issues, which got amplified after the forced grounding of over 50 of the planes. And Dr. Reddy's Laboratories is seeking more than $70 million from Indivior PLC as compensation for lost US sales of its generic version of a leading opioid addiction treatment that was delayed in a patent dispute with a UK-based drug maker. That's all you need to know going into trade today. There's a lot more coming up in just a short while, so do stay tuned. This is Bloomberg Quint.